Hey, what's good people, man? Platinum Bearded Dread. Question, man. What are you afraid of? What do you fear? Now, before you turn around and say, I don't fear anyone, man. I don't fear anything. Think about it for a second, yeah? There are very few people on the planet, yeah, that have no fear of anything or anyone. And even if you look at the word fearless, you look at the great ones like Malcolm X and, Minister Farrakhan and, Bob Marley, Bruce Lee, who were fearless, Muhammad Ali. If you look at the word fearless, it just means less fear, really. Less fear than the average. Doesn't mean no fear. But the fact that they have less fear makes them almost like superheroes. And that's all you really need, to be less fearful. But anyway, back to what I was saying, yeah. Very few of us, I can honestly say we're not afraid of anything. But you know what I find interesting? That most times when we think about being afraid of something, we think about the big things, the obvious things like, fear of death, fear of public speaking, fear of, having an accident and stuff like that, losing someone. But we don't often think of the little tiny little fears that we are faced with on a day-to-day basis, like fear of not fitting in with your friends, or fear of presenting a new partner to your parents, or fear of coming out of the closet, as it were. All those types of things. We don't often think about those types of things as fear, but yet really when you think about it, no one fear is greater than the other, because it's all relative. You might get someone who's afraid of pigeons, man, but then is not afraid to fight in a boxing match. It's such a strange thing. I was watching a movie a couple of days ago. What was it called? Called Troy, starring Brad Pitt as the lead actor. Set in Greece, with the warring factions of different cities of Greece. And in this particular scene, you had the two warring factions who wanted to settle a difference. And they all lined up their soldiers on each side, but they came up with the idea that let each army bring their toughest soldier and settle the dispute like that. So one of the armies brought forth their toughest soldier. He was a giant, man. This guy was massive, man. Muscled up, everything, man. Beaten on his chest, all that, the whole lot. Scar on his face. And as he came forward, the leader of that particular army had this smug smile in his face, as if to say, yeah, he leaves that impression on everyone that sees him. And so the other general, if you like, or the leader of the other army, calls out the name, what's his name? I think Achilles, and it's silence. And the opposing army start laughing, because they're like, yeah, well, that always happens. The moment they see who we have, it's a no one wants to turn up. But eventually they make contact with Achilles, who's incidentally sleeping with two women. So in other words, his mind is far removed from anything to do with fighting. But anyway, they manage to get him, he comes forward, and the giant has a smirk on his face, as if to say, is this it? After a few words of exchange here and there, the giant takes out his sword and beats on his chest with his other hand as his comrades start cheering like, this man's about to die, this little man's about to die. Achilles, on the other hand, gets his shield and starts running towards the giant, right? Not away, towards the giant. And the giant starts throwing spears at this character, Achilles, in which Achilles just uses his shield to bounce the spears off as he gets closer and closer. In fact, no, to tell a lie, the giant doesn't produce a sword straight away. He's just throwing his spears, a couple of spears. And then as Achilles' character gets close to the giant, he pulls out a sword, and the giant pulls out his sword. And Achilles takes one leap into the air, and as the giant pulls out his sword, he focuses on one area, jugular vein, pierces him in his jugular vein as he lands towards the giant, and lands on his 2 feet and just keeps on walking. Doesn't even look behind him. A few seconds later, you hear the big thud of the giant dropping dead, and Achilles' army is in obviously happy and ecstatic. Achilles is not even phased until he hears the thud of that giant, and then he turns around and he even goes on to say to the army, "Is there anyone else?" He repeats himself, "Is there anyone else?" Now, why do I raise that even? Why do I even raise that that clip from the film? I was having a conversation with my son about, one of the things that he finds frightening, the idea that, when you join something new and you've got to make new friends with new children and all that stuff. And first of all, I said to him that never changes, even with adults. Some adults find it easier to engage than others. So it's not something to be ashamed of. But I relayed the story of what I've just mentioned to him. And I said, if you look at that particular scenario, that giant represents our greatest fear. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's fear of pigeons or fear of heights or fear of socializing, but that giant represents our greatest fears that are personal to us. And 9 times out of 10, the fact that it's a giant, it means that it looks more menacing, more daunting, more intimidating than it is. And it remains so because, the natural thing in our eyes is to run away from it. But in this movie, Achilles, who is the small character, if you like, he doesn't run away from it. He looks at the giant and runs towards it. The very thing that most people don't. And so first of all, he's already done what most people don't. And most people assume that because he's a warrior, he doesn't have any fear. But you can't necessarily say that, because we just see what's going on the outside. But what we do know, he's running towards his fear. So while this giant is throwing spears at Achilles, which could symbolize all the things that we feel are gonna come about as a result of us facing this fear. But the closer we get to it, the spears are bouncing off his shield. In other words, it looks actually smaller than it was when we started. It doesn't mean it disappears, but because we're running towards it, it's not as monumental because we're almost like engaged in it now. So we don't have time to think about what if, because we're actually meeting it head on, and we're in a kind of relationship with it, if that makes sense. So as these spears are bouncing off his shield, he wants to get close enough right into the fear. And then the ultimate thing that we fear, at the point where the giant takes out his sword. What's interesting is that this character, Achilles, all he's looking at is one spot. He's not looking to waste blows and cut here, cut one spot. He leaps up in the air. What does he go for? The jugular vein, the main vein. Once he hit there, it's all over. Pierces that, and it's a wrap. In other words, all he had to do is think about one thing. Don't think about too many things that you've got to overcome as a result of your fear. Just think about the end result of what you want. Like I said to my son, at the end of the day, what's the end result? All it is that you want to feel more confident, making new friends. Don't look at what might come with it or what might be nervous that comes with it. Just look at the end result, and imagine yourself in that place. In the same way, Achilles' character, he just looked at what he wanted to achieve. Now he pierced the jugular vein. Once he had hit that spot, he didn't even need to turn around. He heard the thud of the giant hit the ground, but he knew he'd done his job. In the same way that once our thoughts are on what we want the outcome to be, constantly, then there's nothing to turn around to check up on anything other than that, because we already know we've already seen the end result, if that makes sense. So while everybody else is excited, saying, wow, look what he did, look at the bravery, look at the Achilles' character is not even moved or excited by it, because he saw it before it happened, and it just came to pass. And I said to my son, to me, that's a metaphor for fear. I know it's not necessarily as simplistic as that, but you could also argue it's not necessarily as complicated as that either, because very few times we find that the actual thing that we did fear was as bad as we thought it was going to be. Very few times, if at all, man. But the only reason why it appears so is because we run in the opposite direction. I'm talking myself here. You know what I mean? We just avoid it. We avoid making that phone call, or having that meeting with our boss, just tell him that we need a raise or we're not happy with work conditions. So we just take the easy option, which is to avoid it. But Achilles' character ran right into it. That's a win. What's the word I'm looking for? You've already won the first battle, walking towards it. As hard and as scary as it is, you've already won the first battle by walking head on towards it. And it's like I said to my son, that anytime, a fear arises in you, and it will, because if it's not one fear, it'll be another one. Think about that giant. Think about how intimidating and how ferocious and how scary, the giant looked. And then think about how Achilles' character walks towards it, not away from it, but towards it. And then think about how he had in mind exactly what he was going to do. Nothing else was on his mind, just the very thing he wanted to do, pierce that jugular vein with a sword. And then think about how, at the end of it all, he didn't need to look back behind him, because he saw what was going to be the end result. And the next time, you get that same fear arising, you just think about that giant. Okay, how small the fear is, just think about, or how big the fear is, think about that giant. And take it from there, man. Fear is such a big subject that this to me is just like a snippet. And I know I'm gonna have to be doing quite a few posts on fear, but that movie just made me, it came at the right time, so I could give this analogy to my son at the right time. And I also find that, when I speak to my son, I'm really speaking to myself. Because as adults, we don't really change that much from children, we don't. There's a core part of us that never really changes, That's why most humans have the similar fears, But anyway, man, Platinum Bearded Dread. Let's slay that giant. Yeah, man. Yeah.